He was invisible to everyone in that ballroom, until the moment he was the only thing standing between a bullet and the most powerful woman in the room. No one looked twice at the maintenance worker with the worn toolbox and the grease-stained coveralls. Not the investors in their tailored suits. Not the security team with their earpieces and their confident stances. Not Avery Sterling herself, the 30-year-old CEO who had built a medical logistics empire from nothing and never once lost a room she walked into. They should have looked, because Ethan Walker had already seen what none of them could, and the clock was running out. If this story already has you leaning forward, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. We drop stories like this every week, the kind that keep you up at night and make you think long after they're over. While you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now settle in, because this one is going to take you somewhere. The Hawthorne Grand Hotel had a way of making people feel like they'd already won something just by walking through the front doors. That was by design. Everything about the place, the 40-foot ceilings in the main lobby, the Italian marble floors that caught light like still water, the scent of white orchids arranged in vases taller than most men, everything had been curated to communicate a single message. You have arrived. Seattle's old money had been holding galas here for 60 years. Tech founders threw product launches in the ballroom. Foreign dignitaries stayed in the penthouse suites overlooking Elliott Bay. The Hawthorne Grand didn't just host important events. It told the people inside them that they were important for being there. Ethan Walker had been mopping a service corridor on the 3rd floor when the call came down from hotel operations that the freight elevator near the East Wing was throwing a fault code again. 3rd time that week. He'd clipped his radio back on his belt, picked up his toolbox, a battered red Craftsman he'd had since before Emma was born, and made his way down through the staff passages that guests never saw, the narrow hallways behind the walls where the real work of a hotel happened. He didn't mind those corridors. They were honest. He came out through a service door near the ballroom loading dock at 9:30 in the morning, and the first thing he noticed was the volume. Not noise exactly, more like pressure, the kind of organized chaos that precedes something big. A crew of AV technicians was running cable across the polished floor of the grand ballroom's side entrance. A catering manager was arguing into a headset about ice sculptures, and 3 women in matching blazers were walking fast with tablets in their arms, talking over each other in the clipped shorthand of people who had already been up for 4 hours. Ethan moved through it the way he moved through most things, without calling attention to himself, reading the room out of habit more than intention. He clocked the exits first. Both main ballroom doors, one service entrance to his left, one to his right, a pair of emergency exits behind the stage that were propped open with rubber wedges to allow equipment to pass through. 4 cameras mounted in the ceiling corners. 1 roving security guard near the stage, young, stiff-shouldered, the posture of a man who'd done his training but hadn't done much else yet. The fault code on the elevator turned out to be a sensor issue. 20 minutes with a multimeter, a replacement proximity switch from his kit, and it was done. He was packing his toolbox back up when he heard the heels on the marble. Fast, purposeful, the kind of pace that expected the room to rearrange itself. Avery Sterling came through the main ballroom doors with 3 people trailing her and another 2 already talking at her from different angles. She was shorter than she looked in press photos, maybe 5'4", 5'5", but she moved like someone much larger, with the unconscious authority of a person who had stopped thinking about whether she belonged in a room a long time ago. Dark blazer, hair pulled back tight, a small silver earring in her left ear. No jewelry otherwise. She was holding a tablet of her own, scanning it while simultaneously listening to the man on her left, who was gesturing at the stage setup and explaining something about sightlines and camera angles. She didn't look at Ethan. He wasn't surprised. He'd gotten used to that. He was latching the lid on his toolbox when the latch caught wrong and the whole thing tilted, and before he could get a hand under it, it hit the marble floor and the lid popped open. Tools scattered, a handful of screwdrivers, a socket set, 2 spare switches, a coil of wire. The sound was sharp and loud and wrong in a ballroom full of carefully controlled noise, and for a moment everything near him paused. "Can we?" Avery's voice, directed at someone on her team, then stopping as she looked over at him. Not a long look. 2 seconds, maybe 3. The kind of look a person gives a minor inconvenience before they file it away and move on. "Can maintenance work in here before the crew finishes setup?" she said. Not to him, to someone on her team. A man in a gray suit who immediately pulled out a radio to sort it out. Ethan crouched down and started picking up his tools. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. "We need this floor clean before 10:30. Still not to him. The ballroom absorbed her again. The sight lines, the camera placement, the podium adjustment, the lighting check. She was already 6 steps deeper into the room by the time he'd gotten the last socket back in the tray. He picked up the toolbox and went back to the service corridor. He had 3 more work orders before noon. A leaking pipe fitting in the kitchen supply room. A thermostat that wouldn't hold temperature in one of the second-floor conference rooms. A lobby bathroom with a drain running slow. He worked through them in order, methodically, the way he worked through most things, and he tried not to think about the ballroom, but he kept thinking about the ballroom. Cool. It was just past 11 when he came back through the east wing on his way to the supply closet, and something made him slow down near the service corridor that ran alongside the ballroom's south wall. He stopped, looked. There was a man in a hotel uniform, white shirt, black vest, the standard banquet server kit, standing near the fire door at the south end of the corridor. Not working, not moving with the urgency of someone who had a task, just standing there, half turned toward the wall, doing something with his jacket. Ethan watched him for 4 seconds. The man pulled his jacket straight, checked the corridor both ways, and moved through a door into the back of the ballroom. It was a small thing, probably nothing. People adjusted their clothes all the time. Servers got nervous before big events. He knew that. But the way the man had checked the corridor, that was the thing. Not the casual glance of someone who wanted to avoid bumping into a colleague. Something more deliberate than that. Something practiced. Ethan had spent 6 years learning to read the difference. He followed at a distance, coming through the same service door into the back section of the ballroom, where the catering stations were being arranged along the east wall. The space was fuller now. Maybe 60 people working. An event this size required a small army of invisible hands. Ethan drifted along the perimeter, tracking the man in the vest, who had crossed to the far side of the room, near the equipment staging area, and stopped again. The same thing. Half turned from the room. Right hand moving under his jacket. Then he rotated slightly and Ethan caught a clear angle on his face. Mid-40s, clean-shaven. A jaw that looked like it had taken hits before and didn't particularly care. The hotel uniform fit him wrong. Too tight across the shoulders. The way borrowed clothes fit someone built for different work. His hands, when they weren't hidden, moved with a stillness that didn't match the controlled chaos around him. Everyone else in that room was doing something, carrying something, adjusting something, talking to someone. This man was waiting. Ethan clocked the camera positions again from where he was standing. The man had placed himself in the gap between camera 2 and camera 3, not the dead center of the blind spot, which would have been obvious, but the edge of it, close enough that the feed from either camera would show only a sliver of his silhouette if it showed anything at all. That wasn't luck. Ethan's pulse hadn't changed. It almost never did anymore when the threat assessment shifted. He'd had that trained out of him a long time ago. The adrenaline spike, the instinctive narrowing, all of it compressed into something quieter and more useful. What he felt instead was a kind of cold clarity that settled over everything and sharpened the details. He went to find security. Ryan Cross was not a man who was used to being interrupted during final prep, and it showed. He was 41, built like a former college linebacker who'd kept most of the muscle and added some extra weight around the middle, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples and the alert eyes of a man who was professionally suspicious of everyone. He ran a legitimate firm. Ethan had checked the credentials visible on Ryan's ID badge, which listed his company as Apex Protective Group, hired security for the Sterling Dynamics launch. He looked like he knew what he was doing. He looked at Ethan the way most people in expensive suits look at men in work clothes when they interrupt an important conversation. "Sir," Ethan said, because that was habit. Address, keep it brief, lead with the most important information. "I need to flag a possible threat in the ballroom. There's a man in a banquet server uniform who's positioned himself in a camera blind spot, and he's got something under his jacket. His behavior doesn't match the rest of the staff. Ryan looked at him for a moment, then at the toolbox, then back at his face. Your maintenance? Yes, but I'm telling you what I saw. How long have you been with the hotel? That wasn't the question Ethan wanted to answer right now. 7 months, but that's not relevant to... It's relevant to me. Ryan's voice wasn't unkind exactly, more like brisk. A man managing 14 moving parts who had just been presented with a 15th by someone outside his chain of concern. Our team has done a full sweep of the venue. We've got plainclothes on the floor, 2 at the entry points, and I've got eyes on both main cameras. If there was someone out of place, my people would have flagged it. Your camera coverage has a gap on the south side of the stage between Mount 2 and Mount 3. He's standing in it. Something moved in Ryan's eyes. Not quite irritation, not quite dismissal. More like the expression of a man recalibrating how long this conversation was going to take. I appreciate you bringing this to my attention, he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. I'll have someone take a look. When? When I can free someone up. He was already turning back to the person he'd been talking to. Do me a favor and stay in the service areas during the event. We don't want additional foot traffic on the floor. Ethan stood there for a moment. Then he went back to the service corridor. He didn't leave. He told himself he was going to do his next work order. He had the paperwork in his back pocket. The conference room thermostat, room 214, 15 minutes of work at most. He should go do it. He should finish his shift, pick up Emma from school at 3:15, heat up the leftover pasta from 2 nights ago that she'd complained about but eaten 2 bowls of, help her with the math worksheet she'd been putting off since Monday. He should go. Instead, he stood in the service corridor with his back against the wall and his toolbox at his feet, watching through the narrow window in the service door that looked out across the ballroom floor. The man in the vest had moved again. He was closer to the stage now. Not dramatically, maybe 12 feet closer than he'd been 15 minutes ago. But the progression was deliberate, controlled. The kind of patient repositioning that doesn't look like movement until you've been watching long enough to map where someone started and where they are now. At 11:45, Ethan went back to the other side of the ballroom and tried again. Different person this time. A woman on Ryan's team, younger, positioned near the main entry. He described what he'd seen with as much specificity as he could. Clothes, position, behavior, the camera gap, the timeline of repositioning. She listened better than Ryan had. Took notes on her phone even. Told him she would pass it up. He watched her approach Ryan 2 minutes later across the lobby. Ryan listened, glanced back toward where Ethan was standing, said something brief, and turned back to his sweep checklist. The woman came back and told Ethan the team had assessed the situation and everything was under control. He nodded. Said thank you. Went back to the corridor. By 12:30, guests had begun arriving. The Hawthorne Grand's ballroom could seat 400, and from what Ethan could see through the service window, they were going to come close to filling it. Investors, press, industry analysts, a handful of politicians. The kind of crowd that filled rooms with noise and ego and the particular energy of people who expected the next few hours to matter. The man in the vest was now positioned 8 feet from the left side of the stage, partially obscured by one of the large floral arrangements that had been placed on stands along the stage perimeter. He wasn't carrying anything in his hands. His right arm was slightly bent, elbow loose, fingers relaxed, the stance of a man keeping his right hand available. Ethan had seen that stance before, in places where the next few seconds could go several different directions, and you needed to be ready for all of them. He pulled out his phone and called the direct number for hotel security, the internal line, not Ryan's team. Got the desk officer, explained the situation in 90 seconds. The desk officer said he'd contact the event security team. Ethan told him he'd already done that twice. The desk officer said he'd escalate it. Ethan looked back through the window. The man in the vest checked his jacket one more time. Then he looked toward the stage where a hotel event coordinator was adjusting the microphone at the podium, which meant the program was less than 30 minutes from starting. Ethan picked up his toolbox, went to the service door, and stepped back into the ballroom. He wasn't going to be able to stop whatever was coming by standing in a corridor. He moved along the east wall, staying close to the catering setup, keeping his pace even and his posture purposeful. A maintenance worker checking something, nothing unusual, nothing to look at. He was monitoring three things simultaneously: the man in the vest, Ryan's two visible plainclothes agents on the floor, and the exits. He was maybe 40 feet away from the man in the vest when he heard the sharp sound of heels on marble again, and Avery Sterling walked through the main ballroom doors with her team and started moving toward the stage. The man in the vest turned to face the stage. His right hand moved toward his jacket. Ethan was already moving. He came in at an angle, not a sprint, not a charge, because either of those would have scattered the crowd and given the man half a second of warning, but a fast, controlled approach that used the floral arrangement as cover until he was close enough that it didn't matter anymore. He was 12 feet away when Ryan Cross appeared from the left, saw him moving fast toward a man near the stage, and made exactly the wrong call. "Hey, stop!" Ryan got a hand on Ethan's left shoulder, and Ethan did something that came back to him the way muscle memory always comes back. Automatic, unhesitating. Redirecting the grip with a sharp rotation that turned Ryan's momentum against itself and moved him aside without hurting him, maybe 2 seconds total, and then Ethan closed the remaining distance to the man in the vest. The knife was already out, a fixed blade, short, the kind designed to do damage in close quarters. And the man had his eyes on the stage, on Avery, who had just reached the podium and hadn't yet looked up. Ethan took the knife hand at the wrist with both of his, rotated it outward against the joint until he felt the grip give, stripped the blade, and put the man face down on the marble with a knee between his shoulder blades before anyone in the immediate vicinity had processed what was happening. The knife made a flat ringing sound as it slid across the floor. The ballroom went silent. Not the polite hush of a program beginning. The sudden total silence of 400 people who had just watched something happen and hadn't decided yet what it meant. Ethan held the man down. He wasn't going anywhere. From the stage, Avery Sterling looked out across the ballroom with an expression he couldn't quite read from the floor. Shock, maybe, or something that hadn't found its name yet. And for the second time that day, she looked directly at him. This time, she didn't look away. The first sound to return to the ballroom was breathing. Not conversation, not movement, just the collective exhale of 400 people releasing air they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Then the murmuring started, low and confused, spreading from the front rows backward like a slow tide. And within 30 seconds, the room had fractured into 100 small conversations that were all asking the same question in different words. Ethan kept his knee on the man's back and his hands on the man's wrists, and waited. He wasn't thinking about the crowd. He was thinking about whether there was a second one. There was almost always the possibility of a second one, a backup position somewhere in case the primary failed, and he was doing a fast scan of the room with his eyes while keeping his weight forward and his grip locked. The man beneath him had stopped struggling. That was either compliance or strategy, and Ethan wasn't ready to find out which, so he didn't ease the pressure. Ryan Cross appeared at his left shoulder, breathing hard, his face a complicated map of emotions that hadn't settled into any single expression yet. He had his hand on the radio at his belt, and he was looking down at Ethan and the man on the floor with the specific expression of someone whose mental model of the last 2 minutes was still catching up to reality. "You need to," Ryan started. "Check the room," Ethan said. "Southwest corner, behind the pillar. I haven't had eyes on it for 90 seconds. Ryan stared at him. "Go," Ethan said. Ryan went. 2 of Ryan's plainclothes agents materialized from somewhere in the crowd, and one of them crouched beside Ethan and produced a zip tie from his jacket pocket, which told Ethan the man was more competent than the last 40 minutes had suggested. Together they secured the man on the floor with efficient, practiced movements. Wrists behind the back, tight, no conversation about it. And Ethan finally took his knee off the man's spine and stood up. His right knee ached. It always ached when he'd been crouched for more than a few seconds in the cold. A souvenir from a training accident he'd never fully documented, because fully documenting it would have meant sitting out of rotation for 8 weeks, and he hadn't been willing to do that. He straightened it carefully, feeling the familiar pull, and looked toward the stage. Avery Sterling had not moved from the podium. That surprised him, actually. Most people, even people who considered themselves composed, moved instinctively away from something like this. Some toward exits, some toward walls, some just sideways in a vague biological need to not be where they were standing. Avery had done none of that. She was standing exactly where she'd been when the knife came out, her hands flat on the podium surface, and she was watching him with an expression he still couldn't fully read across the distance. Her event coordinator, a young woman in a headset who looked like she was very close to the edge of her professional composure, had appeared at Avery's elbow and was clearly urging her away from the stage. Avery wasn't moving yet. Her eyes were still on Ethan. He looked away first. He always looked away first. It was a habit, and he'd never tried to break it because he didn't see a reason to. Seattle PD arrived in 11 minutes, which was faster than Ethan expected given the controlled chaos of the venue. 2 officers first, then 4 more, then a detective named Calloway, who had the permanently tired look of someone who'd been working major crimes for too long and had stopped being surprised by anything. Calloway pulled Ethan aside while his officers handled the man on the floor, who had not said a single word since going down, which told Ethan something about the level of training they were dealing with. "Walk me through it," Calloway said. He had a notepad, but he wasn't looking at it yet. He was looking at Ethan. Ethan walked him through it. The initial sighting in the service corridor, the camera blind spot, the repositioning pattern, the hand placement, and the stance. The 2 conversations with Ryan Cross's team, the timing of the approach relative to Avery reaching the podium. Calloway listened without interrupting, which Ethan appreciated. "How'd you know where he was going to be?" Calloway asked when he was done. "Stage side, that positioning." He'd been moving toward the stage for 40 minutes. If you track the intervals, he was shortening the distance on a consistent schedule, about 8 to 10 feet every 15 minutes. Patient. Ethan paused. He had good discipline. Calloway looked at him steadily. "What kind of maintenance work did you do before this?" "Different kind," Ethan said. Calloway wrote something on the notepad. "I'm going to need you to stay available. We'll have more questions." "I know," Ethan said. "I'll be here." He wasn't wrong about a second operative. Ryan found one, not positioned to attack, but sitting in the 3rd row of guest seating with a press credential around his neck that turned out to be a very good fake. The man had a phone in his hand, and when Ryan's team pulled him up and got the phone, Calloway's people spent a long time looking at what was on it. Ethan didn't know the details. That was Calloway's problem now, not his, but he saw the way the detective's expression shifted when he looked at the screen, and it was the shift of a man who'd just found something that made the picture considerably larger than he'd thought. The launch event didn't happen. Obviously. The venue was locked down within 20 minutes of the incident. Guests were redirected to a holding area in the hotel's secondary conference room, and the media, who had come for a product announcement and gotten something considerably more dramatic, were being managed by a hotel communications person who had the look of a woman earning every penny of her salary and then some. Ethan sat in a chair near the service corridor door and waited to be needed. His toolbox was at his feet. He was thinking about Emma and whether he should call the school and give them a heads up that he might be late, because pickup was at 3:15 and it was already past 1, and he had no idea how long this was going to take. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to the office manager at her school, a woman named Patricia, who had always been understanding about the occasional unpredictable schedule, letting her know he might be a few minutes behind. Patricia texted back a thumbs-up emoji inside 30 seconds. Ethan appreciated that about Patricia. He was putting his phone away when he heard the heels again, not fast this time. Slower, more deliberate, the pace of someone who's choosing each step rather than just moving through a room. Avery Sterling came around the corner of the service corridor alone, which surprised him. He would have expected at least one assistant, one security person, someone with a tablet and a crisis face. But she was by herself, and she wasn't carrying anything, and for the first time since he'd watched her walk into the ballroom that morning, she looked like a person who wasn't entirely sure what she was about to say. She stopped a few feet from him. He stood up, because it felt wrong not to. "You're Ethan Walker," she said. "Maintenance." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. There was something working behind her eyes that wasn't quite discomfort and wasn't quite calculation. Somewhere in between. The expression of someone reprocessing information they thought they'd already filed. "I said something this morning," she said, "about maintenance in the ballroom." She paused. "That wasn't..." Another pause, shorter. I want to apologize for that. He hadn't expected that either. You don't need to. I think I do. She said it without the softness of someone looking for absolution. More like someone correcting a data entry error. Straightforward, a little uncomfortable, but necessary. I dismissed you, twice actually. I didn't realize you'd also talked to Ryan's team until just now. She looked toward the ballroom doors. That was my event, my security setup, my responsibility. The threat was identified, Ethan said. That's what matters. Eventually, she said, after you did it 3 times and nobody listened. He didn't have an answer for that wouldn't sound either gracious or bitter, so he didn't say anything. She looked at him directly then, and the calculation was gone. What replaced it was something simpler, just looking at him, the way people rarely looked at him in this context, like he was a full human being rather than a function. What's your background? She asked. You don't move like someone who repairs thermostats for a living. I do now. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That's not what I asked. Navy, he said. It was the version he gave when the full version wasn't something he wanted to get into, which was most of the time. She waited, and when it became clear he wasn't going to expand on that, she nodded once. Okay, she said. Okay. She glanced back toward the main corridor, where she could probably hear the distant sounds of Calloway's team still working the scene. I have to go deal with all of this. She gestured vaguely, but I wanted to find you first. I appreciate that, he said. She started to leave, then turned back. Your daughter, Emma, right? I heard you tell someone you needed to be somewhere at 3:50. He went still, just slightly. I'll have a car take you, she said. Wherever you need to go, as soon as the detective clears you. She said it the same way she'd said everything else, not as a favor exactly, more like an immediate operational correction. I identified a problem. I'm fixing it. That's not necessary. It's the least I can do. I have a truck, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and this time the almost smile got a little further. Fine, she said. But you're not paying for parking. She left. Ethan sat back down and picked up his phone and looked at it without seeing it for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket and waited for Calloway. The detective kept him for another hour and 20 minutes, which was thorough but not unreasonable given what had happened. Calloway was methodical and patient, and asked his questions in a sequence that told Ethan he was working from a framework rather than improvising, which he respected. He asked about the specific behaviors Ethan had observed, the timing, the angles, the gap in camera coverage, the nature of the man's grip on the knife. He did not ask Ethan how he knew these things in any way that pressed for a detailed answer, which suggested either that he already had some idea or that he had decided it wasn't the priority right now. You mentioned his stance, Calloway said toward the end. You said it wasn't consistent with someone who just picked up the skill. His footwork was too clean. He was managing distance without thinking about it. That's something you develop over time. Ethan paused. He also didn't panic when I closed. Most people panic when someone closes that fast. He tried to rotate, which was the correct response. He just didn't have enough time to complete it. Calloway wrote something. Trained. Trained, Ethan agreed. We're working on the background. Calloway looked at him. We've got a name from the fake credential on the second man. Still running it. The primary, the one you put down. He's not talking, but we've got prints in the system. Expect something back tonight. He closed the notepad. Can I reach you at the number you gave? Yes. Good. Calloway stood and extended a hand, which Ethan shook. And for what it's worth, he stopped, seemed to reconsider the sentence, then finished it anyway. Good work. Ethan picked up his toolbox. It was 2:48 when he got to his truck in the hotel's employee lot. He had 27 minutes to make it to Emma's school, which was 15 minutes away on a normal traffic day in Seattle. And this was not a normal traffic day because there were news vans blocking 2 of the main approaches to the hotel, and the surrounding streets were backed up with rubberneckers and rerouted buses. He took the back way, through the industrial corridor east of the waterfront, and he pulled into the school pickup line at 3:19, which was technically late, but within the window Patricia had assured him was fine. Emma was standing at the edge of the pickup area with her backpack on both shoulders and her soccer cleats hanging from one hand by the laces, and she spotted his truck before he'd fully stopped and came over at the loose, long-legged jog that she'd had since she was 5. She yanked the passenger door open and climbed in and dropped her cleats on the floor and immediately started telling him about something that had happened at lunch involving her friend Mia and a chocolate milk carton that had gone wrong in some spectacular way he couldn't quite follow. He listened. He kept his eyes on the road, and he listened. And after about 4 blocks, the particular tightness in his chest that he'd been carrying since the moment the knife came out. Maybe since before that, since the first time he'd stood in that service corridor and known that something was wrong and known that nobody was going to believe him. That tightness started to ease. "Dad," Emma said, mid-sentence about the chocolate milk. "Yeah." "You're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you're listening, but you're also somewhere else." He glanced at her. She was watching him with the particular expression she'd developed in the last year or so. Serious and a little too knowing for 8, the expression of a kid who'd spent a lot of time reading adults. "Long day," he said. "What happened?" "Work stuff." She looked at him for another moment. "You're okay, though?" "I'm okay," he said. And then, because she would find out eventually, and he wanted it to come from him first. "Something happened at the hotel. You might see it on the news, or one of the other kids might mention it. Someone tried to hurt a person at an event, and I helped stop it." Emma was quiet for about 5 seconds. "Did you get hurt?" she asked. "No." "Did the other person?" "The person who needed help is fine." Another silence. He could see her processing it, filing it into whatever mental category she kept for the things about him that she didn't fully understand yet but had decided to trust. "Okay," she said, finally. "Okay?" "I mean, yeah." She looked out the window. "You were in the Navy. I know you know how to do stuff." Ethan looked at the road. "Can we have pizza tonight?" she asked. "We have leftover pasta." "That's not the same. It's food. It's sad food." He didn't answer right away, and she took the silence as the negotiating territory it was. "If I do the math worksheet," she said, "without being asked, that's supposed to happen anyway. But if I do it before dinner, without being asked." He was quiet for a moment. She was watching him with the focused attention of someone who understood leverage. "Call it in when we're 5 minutes out," he said. Emma made a sound that was somewhere between a cheer and a sigh of relief, and pulled out her phone to find the number for the pizza place they always ordered from. And Ethan drove them home through the gray Seattle afternoon with the heater running and his daughter talking beside him. And if he thought once about the man on the marble floor and the knife sliding across the stone, he kept it where it belonged, behind him, in the past, where the things that had happened in his life were allowed to live as long as they stayed there. The coverage hit the evening news at 6. He knew it would. A foiled assassination attempt at a high-profile tech launch in one of Seattle's most recognizable venues was exactly the kind of story that had all the elements producers loved, and they hadn't let him down. He had the television on low in the kitchen while Emma did her math worksheet at the table, and he heard his own name mentioned without a photograph, which he was grateful for. The story was thin on specifics because the specifics were still with Calloway's team, but the broad strokes were accurate. An individual with a concealed weapon had been apprehended by a hotel employee before he could reach the stage. Hotel employee. He could live with that. Emma looked up when she heard his name. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Hotel employee," she said. Technically accurate. She considered this. "Did you want them to say more?" "No." She went back to her worksheet. "Good," she said, as if that settled something. His phone had been buzzing steadily since 3 in the afternoon. Unknown numbers, 2 calls from the hotel's general manager, a voicemail from a journalist that he deleted without listening to past the first sentence, and 3 texts from co-workers at the hotel that ranged from, "What the hell?" to, "That was you," to a gif of someone raising a glass, which he thought was from Marcus in facilities but couldn't be sure. He answered the hotel general manager's calls. A man named Okafor, who was professional and grateful, and told Ethan he was taking the following 3 days off with full pay, which Ethan tried to decline, and Okafor declined to hear. He texted Marcus back a brief acknowledgement. He ignored everything else. At 8:30, he got Emma through the shower and into bed, and she wanted him to read to her, which he did. 3 chapters of the book they'd been working through for the past 2 weeks. A story about a girl who discovers her grandmother was secretly a codebreaker during a war, which Emma had become quietly obsessed with. He read until she was asleep, which took longer than usual because she kept asking questions about the book, or about him, or about things that had been on her mind and surfaced now that she was still. "Dad," she said somewhere in the middle of chapter 3, her voice already getting the slow quality of someone sliding toward sleep. The lady you helped, is she okay?" "She's fine." "Did she say thank you?" He thought about the service corridor and the almost smile, and "You're not paying for parking." "Yeah," he said. "She did." Emma made a small sound of satisfaction and pulled the blanket up and didn't ask anything else. He sat in the chair beside her bed for a while after she fell asleep, in the way he'd gotten in the habit of doing since she was born, just sitting there in the dark, listening to her breathe, which was the most reliable thing he'd found for the particular kind of restlessness that came on him sometimes late at night, the kind that didn't have a clear cause and didn't respond to logic. Tonight he knew the cause, which was almost easier. He'd spent 7 months convincing himself that he'd made a clean break, that the version of him who could read a room the way he'd read that ballroom, who could track a threat pattern, who could assess a man's training level by the way he planted his feet, who could move through a hostile situation without his hands shaking, that version was something he'd left behind, like equipment that belonged to a different job. He'd told himself that often enough that he'd mostly believed it. Today had made it harder to believe. He wasn't sure yet whether that was a loss or not. He got up quietly, careful not to wake her, and went to do the dishes. Ryan Cross called at 9:47. Ethan was on the couch with the television off and a glass of water he hadn't drunk, and he looked at the number for one ring before answering. "I owe you an explanation," Ryan said without preamble. "You don't." "I'm going to give you one anyway." A pause, and in the pause, Ethan heard something that he recognized. A man trying to find the right way into a conversation he'd been rehearsing for a few hours. "I looked at the camera feeds this afternoon, after everything, frame by frame." Another pause. "You were right about the gap. I missed it in the sweep." "Gaps happen." "Not on my watch, they don't." His voice was flat. Not self-pitying, more like a man making a factual correction about something he'd done wrong. "And you came to me twice. I didn't—" He stopped. Started again. "I made an assumption about who you were based on what I saw, and that assumption almost cost someone their life. I wanted you to know I understand that." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. "Calloway's team got the ID on the primary. His name is Dale Morrow. Former private security, mid-level enforcement, did contract work in the gray market for about 6 years. We've got a thread that connects him to a man named Garrett Finch, former exec at a company called Nexus Bio. You'll probably be hearing that name tomorrow." "I don't need the details," Ethan said. "I know, Ryan exhaled. "I wanted you to know it was real. What you saw was real, and I missed it." A beat. "How'd you see it?" Ethan leaned back. "He was too still," he said. "Everyone else in that room was moving like they had somewhere to be. He was moving like he was waiting to be somewhere." Ryan was quiet. "It's a small thing," Ethan said. "You get used to looking for it." "Where do you learn to look for it?" "Different job," Ethan said. The same answer he'd given Avery, the same shorthand he used for everything before. Ryan seemed to understand that the shorthand was the whole answer he was going to get. "I want to buy you a beer, he said, "or coffee, if you don't drink." "Beer's fine." "This week?" Ethan thought about his schedule. Emma's soccer practice Wednesday, the 3 days off Okafor had insisted on, the long list of deferred things he'd been meaning to get to around the house that never quite made it to the top. "Thursday," he said, "after 5. "Thursday," Ryan agreed. "I'll text you." He hung up, and Ethan sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and outside the window the Seattle rain had started again. The gentle, persistent kind that fell here most of the year. Not dramatic, just present. The way the weather in this city was always just present, doing its thing whether you accommodated it or not. He finished the water, rinsed the glass, turned off the kitchen light. He stopped in the hallway outside Emma's door and listened until he heard the steady rhythm of her breathing, and then he went to bed. The name Garrett Finch was on the front page of the Seattle Tribune's digital edition by 6 the next morning. Ethan saw it on his phone before he got out of bed, because he'd made the mistake of checking his phone before he got out of bed, which he'd promised himself he wouldn't do anymore and kept doing anyway. He read the headline twice, then the first 4 paragraphs, then put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay there staring at the ceiling for a minute before the smell of the coffee he'd set on a timer the night before pulled him up. The Tribune had more than Calloway had shared with him. Either the paper had a source inside the department, or the story had enough public-facing threads that a decent reporter could pull it together without one. Garrett Finch, 53, formerly Chief Operating Officer of Nexus Biosystems, a mid-sized medical supply firm that had competed directly with Sterling Dynamics in the Pacific Northwest market. 3 years ago, Avery's company had won a contract that effectively ended Nexus's primary revenue stream. Finch had tried to restructure, failed, lost the company, lost a subsequent lawsuit he'd filed against Sterling Dynamics, and by most accounts had spent the intervening period in a slow, grinding financial and personal collapse. His ex-wife had filed for divorce 14 months ago. His eldest son, according to someone the Tribune described only as a family associate, hadn't spoken to him in over a year. There was no photograph of Finch in the article. There was a photograph of the Hawthorne Grand, taken from across the street, with the kind of dramatic low angle that made an ordinary building look like a crime scene. Ethan poured his coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the neighbor's cat pick its way along the top of the fence in the gray morning drizzle, and he thought about what it took to go from losing a business to orchestrating something like what had happened yesterday. He didn't have a clean answer. He'd seen enough of what prolonged loss did to people, the way it hollowed things out, the way it made the simplest human calculations go wrong, to know that the path from grievance to this kind of decision wasn't always as long as it should be. Emma came downstairs at 7:10 in her soccer socks and her school sweatshirt with the hood up, which was her standard Tuesday morning configuration. She poured herself cereal without being asked, which was unusual enough that he noticed it. "What do you want?" he said. She looked up from the cereal. "Nothing." "You poured your own cereal." "I always pour my own cereal." "Not on Tuesdays." She was quiet for a moment, stirring. "Mia's mom texted my teacher," she said, "about yesterday. Mia told her dad that something happened at the hotel, and her dad told her mom, and her mom texted my teacher to ask if you were okay." She looked up. "Everyone's going to know today." Ethan put his mug down. "Does that bother you?" Emma thought about it with the genuine deliberateness she applied to questions she took seriously. "I don't know," she said. "It's kind of weird. Like, you work at a hotel and now you're on the news." "I'm not on the news. My name is." "Marcus texted you 4 times. You read my texts?" Your phone was face up on the counter. She had the grace to look marginally guilty. "Also Mia's mom." He picked up his coffee again. "What did Mia's mom want?" "She wants to know if you're single." Ethan looked at his daughter. Emma looked back at him with an expression that was approximately 70% innocent and 30% something else. "She's very nice," Emma added. "Eat your cereal. She coaches the Tuesday soccer clinic." "Emma, I'm just saying." He drove her to school, and the Tuesday morning drop-off line was the same as it always was. A slow crawl of minivans and SUVs and the occasional confused rideshare driver. And Emma got out with her backpack on both shoulders and her cleats in her hand and then leaned back through the open door. "Don't watch the news today," she said. "I wasn't going to." "You were definitely going to." She closed the door and jogged toward the entrance, and he watched her go until the line behind him started moving, and then he drove away. He watched the news. Not all day. He wasn't that undisciplined, but he had it on in the background while he did the things he'd been deferring around the house. A gutter section that needed resealing, the bathroom faucet that had been dripping since October, a shelf in Emma's room that had been pulling away from the wall for 2 months. He worked through the list, and the television murmured in the other room, and he caught pieces of the coverage without specifically seeking it out, which he told himself was different. By noon, Garrett Finch had been named publicly. By 1, there was footage of Finch being escorted into a downtown federal building by 2 men in suits who were not identified but whose professional posture was specific enough to narrow it down. By 2, a former colleague of Finch's was on a cable news program explaining the man's professional history in the careful, detached tone people use when they're trying to be fair about someone they've already decided was wrong. Dale Morrow, the man Ethan had put on the marble floor, had a lawyer by mid-morning and had not said a public word, which was the smart move and not surprising. The second man, the one Ryan's team had pulled from the third row with the fake press credential, was identified in the afternoon coverage as a former associate of Morrow's from his private security work. His name was Carl Bettis. He'd also stopped talking. Calloway called at 2:15. "You watching the coverage?" the detective asked. "Some of it. We've got Finch in federal custody. The DA is coordinating with the FBI on the conspiracy charge. The interstate elements complicate jurisdiction, but that's above my pay grade." He paused. "I wanted to update you because you're going to be called as a witness if this goes to trial." "I expected that. It'll be a while. These things move slow." Another pause, longer this time. "You got calls from media?" "Some." "You talked to any of them?" "No." "Keep it that way for now. Our public affairs office is handling the narrative." He said narrative the way cops said it, when they meant the version of events we can control. "The DA's office may want to meet with you this week if you're available." "I'm available." "Good." Calloway sounded like he was about to hang up, then didn't. "One more thing. The gap in the security coverage. The camera blind spot you identified. I pulled the floor plan from the hotel's system. That gap was known to hotel security. It was on the punch list for their upgrade cycle." Ethan processed that. "When was it scheduled to be fixed?" "Next quarter." A dry pause. Someone in Finch's network had access to the hotel's maintenance records. That's how they knew about the gap. That's why Morrow positioned himself there. He let that sit for a moment. "You spotted it anyway." "He was still doing something visible," Ethan said. "The gap helped him avoid the cameras. It didn't make him invisible." "No," Calloway said. "It didn't." After the call, Ethan sat at the kitchen table for a while with his hands flat on the surface. The maintenance records. Someone had done real groundwork on this. Not just the access to Avery's schedule, not just the recruitment of trained operators, but the architectural detail of the venue, the security infrastructure, the gaps in coverage. This wasn't a man in a spiral of loss making a reckless decision. This was a man in a spiral of loss who had spent real time and real resources on a deliberate plan. That made it worse somehow, not more frightening. He'd moved past frightened before he'd even gotten involved, but worse in the way that premeditation always made things worse, the cold weight of it. He put it away and went back to the gutter. 10. Thursday came around without much ceremony. He met Ryan Cross at a bar called Leland's, 3 blocks from the Hawthorne Grand, which struck Ethan as either an odd choice or a deliberate one. The place was the kind of establishment that had been there for 30 years, and would probably be there for 30 more. Dark wood, booths with cracked vinyl, a bartender who appeared to have opinions about everything and kept them largely to himself. Ryan was already there when Ethan arrived, in civilian clothes that still managed to look professional, like the man had a body type that wouldn't accept casual. They shook hands and ordered. Ryan had a whiskey, Ethan had a beer. They talked about small things for a few minutes, the way men do when they're working up to the real conversation, and then Ryan put his glass down and said, "Tell me what you actually did before." "Navy," Ethan said. "I did Navy research," Ryan said. "It's publicly available if you know what you're searching for." He looked at Ethan. 6 years active, SEAL qualification, 2 overseas deployments, separated, not discharged, separated, 8 years ago. He paused. Then 18 months with a firm called Meridian Group. Executive protection, high-risk assessment, close protection details for private clients. You left Meridian 5 years ago. Ethan looked at his beer. "There's nothing after Meridian in the public record," Ryan said. "Nothing I could find." "Because there's nothing to find." "Is that true?" "It was mostly true." "Close enough," Ethan said. Ryan nodded, accepting the boundary without pressing through it. "What made you leave protection work?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. The bar had a low-level buzz around them. Not crowded, but occupied, the sound of a Thursday evening establishing itself. "Personal reasons," he said. Ryan picked up his whiskey. "How old is your daughter?" 8. "Her mother?" The question wasn't aggressive. It was the kind of question that men asked each other in this kind of conversation. The background, the context, the shape of a life. "She died," Ethan said. 5 years ago." Ryan went still for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it came out plain, without the layered discomfort people usually brought to that kind of response. "It was a long time ago," Ethan said, which was what he always said and was only partially true. 5 years was a long time in some ways. In others, it was still happening. "Is Emma why you left the work?" "Emma is why I do most things," Ethan said. Ryan sat with that. He took a drink. Ethan took a drink. Outside, a bus went past, and the bar's front window shook slightly in its frame, which it apparently did every time because the bartender didn't look up. "I want to ask you something," Ryan said, "and I want you to know I'm asking it straight, not as a pitch. Ask it. What I do, what my firm does, we need people who see the way you see. The gap identification, the behavioral assessment, the pattern tracking. I've got guys who train for it and work at it for years." He paused. "You did it in a hotel corridor after a toolbox fell on the floor." Ethan looked at him. "I'm not saying change your life," Ryan said quickly. "I'm saying, say, consulting. Occasional, venue assessments, advance work, protocol review. The kind of thing that doesn't require you to be somewhere dangerous or be someone you don't want to be anymore." He stopped. "I know what it costs to walk away from that world. I know you probably didn't do it casually. I'm not asking you to walk back into it." He turned his glass on the bar. "I'm asking if there's a version that makes sense." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I'll think about it," he said. Ryan nodded. "That's all I'm asking." They talked for another hour about other things. Ryan's firm, the logistics of the investigation, the particular absurdity of the fake press credential that Carl Bettis had been using, which turned out to have been made by a document forger in Portland, whose work was apparently so good that 2 of Ryan's people had initially accepted it as real. They talked about Seattle in November, which was either beautiful or oppressive, depending on your relationship with Gray. Ryan had 2 daughters of his own, both teenagers, and he described the experience of parenting teenagers in the specific tone of a man who was genuinely bewildered by how he'd gotten here, which Ethan found more relatable than he expected. He drove home with the windows cracked despite the cold, the way he did sometimes when he needed the air to think, and he thought about what Ryan had said and what it would mean and what it would cost. And he didn't come to a conclusion, but he wasn't sure he needed one yet. The call from Avery Sterling came on Friday afternoon. Not from an assistant, not from her communications team, not a scheduling email. From her directly, on a number he didn't have saved, and she identified herself on the first sentence in the same efficient way she did everything. "It's Avery Sterling. Do you have 10 minutes?" He was in the employee parking lot of a hardware store, which was not a glamorous place to receive a call from a tech CEO, but he hadn't planned on the call. "I have 10 minutes, he said. "I'm putting together a debrief on the security protocols for the launch, the failures in the chain, where things broke down and why." She spoke like she thought, in clean, organized units, one idea completing before the next began. "I've gone through Callaway's report, Ryan's incident summary, the venue's own after action, but I want to hear it from you directly. Your read on the sequence. You want to know what I saw and when. I want to know what you saw and when and why nobody else saw it. In that order." He leaned against the side of his truck. The hardware store parking lot had a view of a storage facility and a stretch of I-5 overpass, which was not scenic, but the light was doing something interesting with the low clouds and the concrete columns, and he found himself looking at it while he thought about how to answer her honestly. "The first thing is attention allocation," he said. "Everyone in that room was focused on the event. The production, the lighting check, the guest flow. That's normal. Big events create a strong focal center, and everything else becomes peripheral." He paused. "Your security team was focused on the obvious threat vectors, entry points, perimeter, They had a framework, and they were working it. And you weren't working a framework. I wasn't working anything. I was fixing an elevator. The man stood out because I had no expectations about who was supposed to be where. I didn't have a protocol telling me what to look for, so I just looked. A pause on her end. You're saying the framework was a liability. I'm saying the framework made certain things visible and certain things invisible. That's true of every framework. He thought about how to say the next part. Your team was also managing a resource I didn't have. What resource? Credibility pressure. They had credentials to maintain, a presentation to make to you, to the venue, to each other. When I came to them and they had to decide how to respond, part of that decision was about what it looked like to take a maintenance worker's concerns seriously in front of their colleagues. He said it flatly, without edge. That's not an excuse, it's a factor. A longer pause. I told Ryan to handle it, she said. When you came to me with the toolbox. I know. I didn't look at you. I looked at the toolbox. He didn't say anything. I want to fix that, she said. Not personally. I mean structurally, in the way the organization runs, the way we decide whose input gets taken seriously. She paused. I've been thinking about this since Tuesday. I run a company with 400 employees, and I think I've been doing that exact thing for a long time without realizing it, deciding who to listen to based on where they're standing when they talk to me. Her voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it, not quite discomfort, something more like the honest disorientation of a person looking at a thing about themselves they'd rather not see. I'd like to meet with you, not about the investigation, separately. I want to hear more about how you assess situations, how you read people. I think it would be useful. Ethan looked at the concrete columns and the clouds. What kind of meeting? I'm free Sunday afternoon, she said. Somewhere neutral? Coffee, if you want. An hour. A brief pause. I know you don't owe me your time. Sunday afternoon, my daughter has soccer, he said. What time does it end? He thought. 12:30, usually. 2:00, she said. He was quiet for a moment, doing the thing he always did with decisions like this. Not deliberating exactly, more like sitting with the weight of the thing to see if it felt right or wrong. 2:00, he said. Thank you, she said, and hung up. Sunday morning was the kind of November morning that Seattle produced with consistent regularity. Cold enough to see your breath. Sky the flat white of old paper. The air carrying the particular damp that settled into your jacket and stayed there. Emma's soccer game was at 10, which meant they left the house at 9:15, which meant Ethan was up at 7 making sandwiches because Emma had declared last week that the granola bars he usually packed were, her word, tragic. The game was in a park in the Northgate neighborhood, on a field that had clearly been designed with drainage in mind and still managed to develop a standing puddle in the southeast corner every time it rained, which the kids had collectively decided was a feature rather than a problem. Emma's team was the Northgate Lightning, which they'd voted to name themselves in September, and which Ethan thought was a perfectly fine name, even though Emma had lobbied hard for the Northgate Thunder and still hadn't fully accepted the outcome of the democratic process. He stood on the sideline with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched Emma play with the focused, slightly manic energy she brought to everything physical. She wasn't the best player on the team. That was a girl named Rosie, who had been playing since she was 4 and moved on the field with a natural fluency that was already something to watch. But Emma competed with a relentlessness that her coach, a retired high school physical education teacher named Bergstrom, had once described to Ethan as the kind of attitude you can't teach. She scored once, a scramble goal from close range that was more persistence than technique, the ball going in off her shin after she'd chased a loose clearance further than anyone else had bothered to. And she turned and found him immediately in the sideline crowd with the instinctive radar kids had for their parents. And he raised a fist, and she raised one back, and then she was running upfield again. The Lightning won 3-2, which produced the specific contained joy of a team that hadn't expected to win and then did. Emma came off the field flushed and muddy around the knees, eating orange slices with the efficient focus of someone refueling, and she told him about the goal with the particular energy of someone who'd already replayed it several times and found it improved with each retelling. Rosie passed it to me, she said. I saw. I almost missed it, but you didn't. My shin is kind of bruised. Hazard of the sport. She considered this philosophically and ate another orange slice. Can I get hot chocolate on the way home? I have to be somewhere at 2. That's fine. It's only 11:30. She looked at him. Where are you going? Meeting. Work meeting? A meeting. She studied him with the expression she deployed when she suspected he was withholding something relevant. Is it the lady from the hotel? Why would you think that? Emma shrugged with the elaborate casualness of someone who had thought about this before the question was asked. Because she'd want to say thank you properly. That's what you'd do. He didn't confirm or deny it, which Emma took as confirmation, which was fair. They got hot chocolate from a drive-thru on the way home, and Emma spent the ride elaborating on the second half of the game, and Ethan listened and drove and thought about what you said to someone like Avery Sterling over coffee when the circumstance that connected you was already fading into the official record of an ongoing investigation. The cafe Avery had suggested was in Capitol Hill. Small, unpretentious. The kind of place that had been there before the neighborhood changed around it and had managed to stay by being reliably good at a limited number of things. He got there 4 minutes early, and she was already at a corner table with a coffee in front of her and her phone face down, which he noticed because most people with her kind of schedule didn't put their phones face down. She looked different without the blazer and the event day energy. Not smaller exactly, but more specific, a person rather than a presence. She'd cut her hair since Tuesday, or maybe just worn it differently. He couldn't tell, and it didn't matter. Thanks for coming, she said. He sat across from her. A server appeared and he ordered coffee, black. How's your daughter? Avery asked. She scored today. Soccer? Yeah. Avery smiled at that. A real one, not the polished version. My niece plays. She's 9. She paused. She's not good, honestly, but she tries incredibly hard and it's the most fun thing to watch. That's most of it, Ethan said. His coffee came. She wrapped both hands around her own cup, and for a moment she just sat there, and he got the impression she was doing the same thing he did sometimes, sitting with the weight of what she wanted to say before she said it. I told you on the phone I wanted to understand your assessment process, she said. That's true, but it's also not the whole reason I wanted to meet. She looked at him directly. I wanted to meet you without the event around us, without the thing that happened being the only thing in the room. She paused. I treated you poorly on Tuesday morning, before everything, and I wanted to be in a situation where I apologized for it without it being attached to the fact that you'd just saved my life, because that context makes it complicated. He looked at her. You already apologized. In a service corridor right after a trauma response. She shook her head slightly. That doesn't count. He thought about that. Why not? Because apologies should be given when you're choosing to give them, not when you're processing shock and looking for something to say to the person who just kept you from being stabbed. She said it plainly. This counts. He was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. I accept it. Just like that? What would you prefer? She looked at him, and there was something that might have been the beginning of something. Not the almost smile from before, something more open than that. And then she picked up her coffee cup and they both drank, and the conversation became a different kind of thing after that. They talked for 2 hours, which was twice what either of them had planned. She asked him about situational awareness, and he told her what he could honestly tell her, not the full context of where he'd learned it, but the practical architecture of it. What you looked for, how you calibrated your attention, the difference between what people said and how they stood when they said it. She asked good questions. Not the questions of someone performing curiosity, the questions of someone who is actually revising something, building a new mental model from the materials of the conversation. He asked her about the company because she'd mentioned it, and because he was genuinely curious about how someone built what she'd built at 30 and what the cost of it looked like from the inside. She was honest about it in a way he hadn't expected. The years of working before she could afford an office, the partnership that had collapsed badly and cost her a friendship she still thought about, the quarter when the company almost didn't survive, and she'd told no one because she was convinced that certainty, projected hard enough, could substitute for the actual thing. Did it work? He asked. That quarter? Yeah. She paused. It's a bad habit, though, performing certainty instead of building it, She turned her coffee cup. I've been doing it with people too, I think. Deciding who's credible before I listen to them. It's faster, and usually it's not wrong enough to matter. She looked at him. Until it is. Most shortcuts work until they don't, he said. Is that the official SEAL wisdom? He almost laughed. It surprised him, the almost laugh. Not the feeling itself, but the fact that he didn't catch it in time. No, he said. That's just true. She looked at him for a moment. Can I ask you something direct? You've been asking me direct things for 2 hours. This one's different. She paused. Are you happy doing what you do now? He sat with that. The coffee had gone cold and he drank it anyway. Some days, he said. Most days it's fine. A few days it's hard. He thought about the morning after the event, standing at the kitchen window watching the neighbor's cat, thinking about what it meant that the skills he'd tried to put away had come back so cleanly. I didn't leave the work I did before because I hated it, he said. I left it because I needed to be something else for her. And most of the time that feels like the right call. Most of the time, Avery said. Yeah. She nodded slowly, not pushing past it. Outside the cafe window, a bus went by, and the light shifted, and the afternoon was already starting to thin at the edges the way November afternoons did in this city. I should probably get back, he said. Yeah. She picked up the check before he could reach for it, and he let her because it seemed like the right thing to let her do in this specific situation. They walked out together and stopped on the sidewalk in the cold air, and she put on a coat she'd had over her arm, and he zipped his jacket, and they stood there for a moment in the way of two people who'd just spent more time talking than they'd planned and hadn't quite figured out what that meant about the next time. Ryan told me he talked to you, she said, about consulting work. He did. Is that something you'd consider? He looked at her. Are you asking as someone who works with Ryan's firm? I'm asking as someone who thinks the world needs more people who see what you see, and it seems like a waste for you to only use it on freight elevator sensors. She said it without pressure, just the plain statement of a plain opinion. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. I told him I'd think about it. That's fair, she said. She said goodbye and walked to a car parked half a block up, and he walked to his truck in the other direction. And he drove home thinking about what she'd said and what Ryan had said, and the conversation that afternoon and the one before it, and about Emma running upfield with her fist raised after the goal, and about the maintenance records that Finch's network had accessed to find the camera gap, and about how many rooms there were and how many buildings with how many gaps that no one was looking at. He didn't make any decisions on the drive home. He usually didn't. But he was thinking differently than he'd been thinking at the start of the week. And that was something. Emma was on the couch with a book when he got in. The Codebreaker story, still going. And she looked up when the door opened and said, How was your meeting? Fine, he said. She looked at him. Just fine? He took off his jacket and hung it up. Good, he said. It was good. Emma considered this evaluation, found it acceptable, and went back to her book, and Ethan went to the kitchen to figure out what they were having for dinner, and the evening settled around them the way evenings did in that house, quietly, without ceremony, the ordinary weight of a life that was mostly intact. The weeks after the investigation settled into a strange kind of quiet that Ethan hadn't expected. He'd anticipated more. More calls from Callaway, more requests from the DA's office, more of the administrative friction that came with being a material witness in a federal conspiracy case. There was some of that, but less than he'd braced for, and it came in manageable intervals rather than the sustained pressure he'd been preparing himself to absorb. He met twice with the DA's office, answered their questions with the same precision he'd given Callaway, signed documents, reviewed his statement, confirmed dates and timelines. The lawyers were thorough and professional and clearly had what they needed before he walked in the room. The rest of the time he worked. Okafor had given him 3 days off after the incident, and he'd used 2 of them before the restlessness got to be more trouble than the rest was worth. He went back on a Wednesday, picked up his schedule, repaired a ballroom sound system that had been intermittently cutting out during testing, replaced a section of baseboard heating in one of the corner suites, fixed a broken tile in the spa changing room that had been on the list since September. The hotel had a rhythm he'd come to find useful. The way the mornings were about setup and maintenance, the afternoons about event support and guest requests, the evenings about the quiet work that couldn't happen while the building was full. He knew the rhythm now the way you came to know a place after enough time inside it, and that familiarity was something he'd underestimated when he'd first taken the job. Marcus, who ran the facilities desk and had been at the Hawthorne Grand for 11 years, said nothing about the incident for the first 2 days Ethan was back. On the third day, he appeared in the service corridor where Ethan was running a diagnostic on the freight elevator's replaced sensor and said, without preamble, "You could have told me you were some kind of special forces guy." "I'm not a special forces guy," Ethan said. "I'm a maintenance technician." "You put a man on the floor in front of 400 people and took his knife away." "I used to do different work." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Marcus was 54, originally from Lagos, had the unhurried manner of a man who'd worked hard for a long time and had stopped letting things rush him. "You have a good poker face," he said, which from Marcus was a significant compliment. "I've had practice." "You could make more money doing the other thing." "I know." Marcus seemed to weigh that answer, decided it was sufficient, and went back to the facilities desk without further commentary. That was the full extent of his acknowledgement of the situation, and Ethan found it one of the more genuinely decent responses he'd gotten. Ryan's beer invitation turned into something more than a single Thursday night. They met 3 times in November, twice at Leland's, once at a coffee place nearer to Ryan's office in Belltown. And the conversations expanded gradually from the immediate incident into something broader. Ryan talked about his firm with the candor of a man who was both proud of what he'd built and clear-eyed about where it fell short. Apex Protective Group had 16 full-time staff and a roster of contract specialists, and the work was consistently interesting and occasionally excellent, and once in a while revealed a gap that Ryan couldn't close with the people he currently had. "I keep bringing in ex-law enforcement," he said one evening, "which makes sense. They know the framework. They know how institutions work. But they see the way institutions see." He turned his glass. "You don't see that way." "I don't have a framework," Ethan said. "We've been through this." "I know. I'm making a different point." Ryan leaned forward slightly. "Framework people are good at known threats, things that look like the last threat or the one before that. The training is built to recognize pattern matches." He paused. "You're good at the thing that doesn't match anything yet. You see the beginning of a pattern before it's had enough iterations to look like a pattern." Ethan drank his beer. "That's a generous description of what I did." "It's an accurate one." "I got lucky with the angle. If he'd been positioned 10 feet further right, I might have missed the hand placement." "But you were looking," Ryan said. "That's the point. My guys weren't looking at him at all." That was true, and Ethan didn't argue it. The consulting conversation came up again in the third meeting, and this time Ryan had specifics. Not a full engagement. He was careful about that, careful not to make it sound like pressure. But a specific thing, a particular venue assessment job in February for a corporate client hosting a product launch on the scale of the Sterling Dynamics event. "I want someone to walk the space the way you walk the ballroom," Ryan said. "Not as part of the team, as a separate set of eyes. You give me a written assessment. I cross-reference it with what my team produces. I pay you for your time." "How much time?" "A day, maybe 2. Site walk, documentation, review meeting." Ethan thought about it. "What does it pay?" Ryan told him. It was more than he made in 2 weeks at the hotel. He didn't say yes that night. He said he'd think about it, which Ryan accepted without pushing, and Ethan drove home and thought about it for 2 days before he called Ryan back and said he'd do it. It wasn't a decision about changing his life. He was clear about that with himself. It was a decision about one job in February, and after that, he'd see. Emma found out the way she found out most things, by asking a direct question at an unexpected moment. They were in the car, heading back from her Wednesday soccer practice, which had run 20 minutes over because Bergstrom had wanted to work on a set piece that kept going wrong, and Emma was in the passenger seat with her cleats off and her feet on the dashboard, which he normally objected to and tonight had let pass because he was thinking about something else. "Are you going to keep working at the hotel?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Where did that come from?" "Just thinking." She was looking out the windshield. Marcus texted you. I wasn't reading your texts. It was on the home screen. What did Marcus say? He said the guest in suite 412 is asking for you specifically to fix his thermostat because he doesn't trust the new guy. She paused. Who's the new guy? Someone they hired last week. Is he bad at thermostats? I don't know yet. Emma was quiet for a moment. So you're still going to be there. For now, she turned her head and looked at him. She did that sometimes. The full look. The one that didn't leave room for vague answers. But not forever. I don't know, he said. Why are you thinking about this? She looked back at the windshield. Mia's dad changed jobs, she said. He was gone for like 2 months doing training for the new thing, and Mia said it was weird. Like, he was there, but he was also kind of not there. Ethan drove. Is that what you're worried about? I'm not worried, she said, with the specific emphasis of someone who was working on not being worried. I just want to know. Know what? If something changes, you'll tell me, right? Not like, explain everything. Just tell me if something's going to be different. He looked at her again. She was still watching the road ahead, her feet still on the dashboard. The mud on her shin guard dried now to a pale crust. 8 years old and asking him to be straight with her, which was a conversation he'd thought he had more time before. Yeah, he said. I'll tell you. She seemed satisfied with that. She turned the car radio on and found the station she liked. Some kind of pop that he didn't know well enough to identify, but that she seemed to know every word of. And she sang along quietly, not self-consciously, the way kids sang when they forgot you were listening, and he kept driving and let the warmth of that fill up the car. The DA's office called in early December with news that the case against Garrett Finch was moving faster than expected. The federal component had accelerated the timeline, and the conspiracy charge carried enough weight that Finch's attorney had opened preliminary conversations about a plea arrangement, which Calloway mentioned to Ethan in a brief call that sounded like the detective was also surprised by the pace. If he takes a deal, trial is off the table, Calloway said. You'd still give a deposition, but we wouldn't need you on the stand. That's fine, Ethan said. Thought you'd want to know either way. I appreciate it. Morrow's not dealing, Calloway added. He's taking his chances at trial, which means you'd still likely need to testify in that proceeding, separate from the Finch case. Different timeline, probably spring at the earliest. Ethan made a note of it and thanked Calloway and moved on. What he didn't tell Calloway, what he hadn't told anyone except Ryan in the oblique way the conversation had allowed, was that the investigation had changed something in how he thought about the work he'd left behind. Not brought it back exactly. Nothing as simple as that. But the thing he told himself for 5 years, that the version of him who could do what he did in that ballroom was sealed off, separate, accessible only in the kind of extreme circumstance that didn't apply to his life anymore. That version of the story had developed a crack. He'd walked into the ballroom to fix an elevator sensor, and he'd read the room without thinking about it, the way you breathe. And the only difference between that morning and the 7 months of mornings before it was that the morning had presented something worth reading. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. He sat with it the way he sat with most things he didn't have an answer for. Not worrying at it, not forcing a conclusion, just letting it be present while he got on with the day. Avery Sterling called on a Thursday in the second week of December, not to discuss the investigation this time, but with something that caught him off guard. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it's completely optional, she said, which was how she started conversations now, with a kind of careful honesty that he'd come to associate specifically with her. I'm doing an all-hands meeting next week, the whole company. I want to talk to them about something that's been on my mind since the event, about how we operate, how we listen to each other. The way we've been deciding who gets heard. She paused. I'd like you to be there. At your company meeting. I'm not asking you to speak, just to be in the room. Another pause. It's relevant to what happened, and I think some of the things I'm going to say will land differently if the person who demonstrated them is physically present. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to say? That we've been making a particular kind of mistake, consistently, deciding whose input matters before we've heard it, based on where someone sits in the org chart or what their job title is. She said it with the flat precision of someone who'd been working on the phrasing. I'm going to tell them about the event. Not the security details. Calloway's office has asked us to be careful about what we discuss publicly, but the principle of it. That the person who saw the threat most clearly was the person we were least inclined to listen to. She paused. I want to say it to 400 people, and I want the man it's about to be standing in the room. That's a significant ask, he said. I know. He looked out the window. The December sky over Seattle was the color of old pewter, the kind of afternoon that arrived at 3 and felt like 6. He thought about what it meant to be in a room like that, not as an anonymous maintenance worker, not as a name in a police report, but as a specific person being talked about for a reason that meant something to him. Will there be press? He asked. No, internal event only, no recording released externally. Is Emma old enough to understand what you'd be saying? A pause. Does she need to be there? I'd want to tell her about it afterward if she could understand it. I think most 8-year-olds could understand the version I'm telling, Avery said. Don't judge people by what they're wearing. He almost smiled. That's a reduction. It's the core, she said. He thought about it for another moment. The thing that turned it from a maybe to a yes was not the logistics or the framing. It was something simpler. He thought about the toolbox hitting the marble floor and the way Avery had looked through him, and Ryan dismissing his concern while checking the wrong things, and the 4 or 5 hours after that in which he was absolutely certain something was wrong, and the only tool available to him was his own certainty. He thought about the fact that he'd been right and it hadn't mattered until the last possible moment, and what it would have cost if he'd been 60 seconds slower. Okay, he said, I'll be there. The Sterling Dynamics all-hands meeting was held on a Tuesday morning at the company's headquarters in South Lake Union, a building that had the self-conscious architectural language of a tech campus, trying not to look like a tech campus, with exposed concrete and wood accents and a main atrium that was designed for exactly this kind of gathering. Ethan wore clean dark jeans and a charcoal flannel and his good boots, which was as dressed up as he was prepared to go, and he arrived 10 minutes early because he always arrived 10 minutes early. A woman at the reception desk gave him a visitor badge, and he found a spot at the edge of the atrium near one of the load-bearing columns, which suited him. Good sight lines to the room, easy egress, close enough to hear and far enough from the center that he wasn't the thing people looked at first. The employees filtered in over the next 20 minutes. He watched them the way he always watched rooms. Not with suspicion, just attention. The low-level observation that had become so habitual, he sometimes didn't realize he was doing it. Young mostly, the particular demographic mix of a mid-sized Seattle tech company, people in their late 20s and early 30s with the specific energy of organizations that were growing fast enough to feel exciting, but not so fast they'd stopped feeling human. He noticed the hierarchy the way it expressed itself physically. The senior people who moved through the room with slightly more purchase, the newer employees who found walls to stand near, the clusters that formed around particular people like warm air around heat sources. Ryan Cross was there, which surprised Ethan until he remembered that Apex had a retained contract with Sterling Dynamics for ongoing security consulting. Ryan spotted him across the room and gave a brief nod. Ethan nodded back. Avery came in from the side, not from the main entrance, without an entourage. She had a wireless microphone in her hand, and she moved to the center of the atrium and waited for the room to find its quiet, which it did quickly, the particular kind of quiet that collected around people with that specific authority. I want to tell you something that happened last month, she said without preamble. Most of you know the broad version, the launch event, the security situation, the arrest. That's been in the news, and I know you've seen it. She paused. What I want to tell you is the part that matters more to me, which is not the arrest. She told it plainly, the toolbox on the marble floor, the maintenance worker with the worn coveralls. The 3 times the warning was given and dismissed. The final moment when the only reason it hadn't ended worse was because one person had trusted what he'd seen over the reluctance of everyone around him to hear it. He came to me first, she said. I walked past him. I didn't look at him. I looked at the toolbox. She let that sit. I want you to think about how many times we do that in this building, every week. We look at the toolbox, we look at the job title, the department, the seniority level, the format of the message, the office someone sits in. She looked around the room. We decide who's worth listening to before we've heard what they're saying, and we don't notice we're doing it because it's fast, and it's mostly invisible, and most of the time it doesn't cost us anything we can see. The room was quiet in the specific way of people who were recognizing something. I'm not saying that to make us feel bad, Avery continued. I'm saying it because we can fix it, and we're going to. Not with a policy memo, not with a training module. She paused. With a different habit. The habit of finishing the sentence before you've decided it's not worth hearing. She looked out at the room. I'm asking you to try that. In your team meetings, in your one-on-ones, in the hallway conversations you have on your way to somewhere else. Finish the sentence. She said a few more things, practical things about channels for input, about a pilot program she wanted to run in 3 of the company's departments, about how she intended to track whether it was actually changing anything, rather than just feeling like a good idea. She was systematic about it even here, which he respected. Then she looked toward the column where he was standing. The person I owe this shift in thinking to is in this room today, she said. He doesn't want to be introduced or pointed at, and I'm going to respect that. But I want him to know that what he did, not the part that made the news, the part before it, the 3 times he told the truth, and nobody listened, and he kept going anyway. That's the part I think about. She paused. That's the part worth emulating. Ethan stood at the edge of the room with his arms at his sides and his face still, and he felt something move through him that he wouldn't have known what to call if he'd tried. Something between discomfort and recognition, the way it felt to be seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong. He didn't look away from her. She didn't look away from him. And then the moment was over, and she was moving to the next part of the agenda, and the room was exhaling, and he was just a man standing near a column in a tech company he'd never heard of 6 weeks ago. After the meeting broke, employees dispersed into smaller clusters, and the atrium returned to the murmur of an ordinary morning. Ryan made his way over and stood beside Ethan and watched the room reset. She's good, Ryan said. Yeah, Ethan said. The pilot program she mentioned, the 3 departments. She asked me to help design the feedback structure for it. Ryan glanced at him. She suggested I talk to you about the assessment component. Ethan looked at him. I know, Ryan said, with the slight tone of a man who'd been asked to relay a message he'd predicted would get this reception. You're thinking about it. I'm always thinking about it. February's still on? February's still on, Ryan nodded. Good enough for now. Avery found him near the elevator bank 15 minutes later, after the room had mostly cleared. She was carrying her microphone in one hand and looked like someone who'd just finished something difficult and was allowing herself 30 seconds to feel that before the next thing began. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for what you said. She shook her head slightly. I meant it, all of it. She paused. How are you? The question was direct without being intrusive, the way she asked most things now. He thought about how to answer it honestly without turning it into a longer conversation than the moment called for. I'm okay, he said. Better than I was expecting to be, honestly. Better how? He considered it. There was a version of me I thought I'd put away, he said. After my wife died, after I left the work, I thought I'd sealed it off. He paused. Turns out I just hadn't needed it for a while. She looked at him steadily. Is that good or bad? I'm still deciding, he said. She nodded slowly. Let me know when you figure it out. You'll probably be one of the last people I tell. That surprised a genuine laugh out of her. Short, unguarded, nothing professional about it. Fair enough, she said. They shook hands, which felt formal given the conversation they'd just had, but also right in a way he couldn't have explained. She went back toward her office, and he went toward the elevator, and he rode down to the lobby and walked out into the December cold and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The city was doing its winter thing, the low light, the wet pavement reflecting the gray sky. The particular smell of Seattle in December that was part rain and part coffee and part something older than either. He stood there and breathed it in and didn't think about anything for a minute, which was its own kind of luxury. Then he got in his truck and drove to pick up Emma from school. She came out of the building at 3:18, backpack on both shoulders, and she climbed in and dropped her bag on the floor and immediately started telling him about something her teacher had said in social studies that she disagreed with. And she disagreed with it carefully and at length, working through her argument with the same relentlessness she brought to the soccer field. He listened and drove and offered counterpoints when they seemed genuinely useful, and let her think out loud when they didn't. "Who's right?" she asked finally. "I don't know enough about it," he said. "But your argument is better structured than you think it is." She considered that. "I could write a letter." "To who?" "To the textbook company, if that's where the wrong information is." "You could," he said. "Would they respond?" "Probably not, but you'd have written it." Emma thought about this. "That counts for something?" "Sometimes the writing is the point," he said, "not the response." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Then, "Did something happen today? You seem like something happened." "I went to a meeting." "The lady?" "Her company," he said. "All hands meeting." "Did she talk about you?" He glanced at her. "Sort of, without using my name." "What did she say?" He thought about how to condense it. "She told her employees to finish the sentence before deciding it's not worth hearing." Emma was quiet for a moment. "That's about you and the guy in the ballroom. And other things. But mostly you." "Mostly," he said. Emma looked out the window at the passing streets, and he could see in her profile the processing she was doing. The same visible thinking he remembered from when she was 5, and working out something that didn't quite fit the mental model she already had. "Are you glad you went?" she asked. He thought about Avery standing in the center of that atrium, saying that's the part worth emulating to 400 people, and the thing that had moved through him. "Yeah," he said. "I'm glad." Emma nodded, satisfied. "Okay." She reached over and turned on the radio, found her station, and started singing along under her breath to a song he didn't know, and the truck moved through the gray Seattle afternoon toward home, and Ethan drove, and outside the window the city did what it always did. Kept going, kept building, kept being exactly what it was, indifferent and full and alive. He thought about February. He thought about the venue assessment, the written report, the thing Ryan had said about people who see the beginning of a pattern before it has enough iterations to look like one. He thought about the sealed-off version of himself and the crack in the seal, and whether a crack was damage or just an opening. He didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in a long time, the question didn't feel like a threat. February came in cold and deliberate, the way Seattle winters sometimes did. Not dramatic, just persistent, the kind of cold that settled into the city's bones and stayed there without apology. Ethan did the venue assessment job for Ryan on the 7th and 8th of the month. 2 days. A corporate conference center in Bellevue, a product launch for a medical device company with a guest list of 300 and a security team that was competent in the ways Ryan's team had been competent before. Framework-oriented, entry-point focused, good at the known variables. Ethan walked the space 4 times over 2 days at different hours with different crowd densities, and he wrote a 14-page report that identified 9 structural vulnerabilities in the security plan and proposed specific remediations for each. He did it without drama, without a sense of occasion. It was work, and he did it the way he did all work, methodically, with his full attention, and then he went home. Ryan called him the evening after he submitted the report. 9 findings, Ryan said, 9 that warranted documentation. There were smaller things. My team found 4. A pause. 3 of which overlapped with yours. Ethan was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, Emma's math homework spread across the table behind him. "So you missed 6. "We missed 6, Ryan confirmed without defensiveness. "The loading dock egress timing was the one that bothered me most. I looked at it after I read your notes, and I could see it. I just hadn't looked at it the right way." "The angle matters," Ethan said. "If you come in from the west side of the dock, you see the gap. If you come from the main entrance route, which is what your team used, the parked vehicles block it." "I know that now." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "I want to do this again. Not just the occasional project. I want to build it in as a standard component of our advanced work for high-risk events, a second eye assessment, separate from the primary team." He paused. "Monthly retainer. I can give you the number tonight if you want it." Ethan looked at Emma's homework. Long division, a page of it, which she had been complaining about for 3 days. "Let me think about it this week," he said. "Take the week," Ryan said, "but I'm not going to stop asking." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I need the week. He took the week. He thought about it at the hotel while fixing things, during Emma's soccer practice on Wednesday, on a long walk he took alone on Saturday morning along the waterfront path that ran south from the ferry terminal. The sound on his left the color of steel, the air clean and cold enough that he could feel it in the back of his throat. He thought about what it meant to go back toward the work, even partially, even in the limited, bounded form that Ryan was describing. He'd spent 5 years treating the skills he had as something to be quarantined, kept separate from the life he was building for Emma, as if proximity to those capabilities would contaminate the ordinary safety of their days. It hadn't made sense to him in the weeks after the Hawthorne Gran incident, when he'd used those skills in a hotel ballroom and come home and helped his daughter with her homework and made pasta, and the ordinary safety of their days had remained exactly intact. He thought about his wife. Claire had been the one who'd insisted he leave the work. Not in a single conversation, not as an ultimatum. She wasn't built for ultimatums. She was built for the slow, patient kind of honesty that found you over time like water finding the low point in a floor. She'd said it over months, in different ways. I'm not asking you to be someone else. I'm asking you to be here. And he'd been stubborn about it in the way he was stubborn about most things, resistant to the idea that the work he did could be something he left rather than something he was. It wasn't until the mission in the 3rd year, the one that went wrong in a way he'd never fully documented, because fully documenting it would have meant accepting that his judgment had contributed to the outcome, that he'd understood what she'd been saying. He'd left the work. He'd come home to her and to the infant Emma, and he'd had 14 months of the life she'd been describing before the accident that had ended hers and left him with a daughter, and a gap he hadn't known how to name. The thing he hadn't let himself examine closely, in the 5 years since, was whether he'd kept the work quarantined because it was right for Emma or because it was the last thing Claire had asked him to do, and honoring that request was the nearest thing he had left to talking to her. Standing on the waterfront path with the cold coming off the water, he let himself look at that directly for the first time. It sat there like a weight he'd been carrying on the wrong shoulder. Not unbearable, but wrong, and now that he'd noticed it, the wrongness was obvious. Claire had asked him to be present. That had been the actual request. Be here. She hadn't asked him to hollow out the parts of himself that didn't fit the image of a safe life. She'd wanted him whole and present, not reduced and miserable and carefully sealed. He'd understood that once, and then lost it somewhere in the grief of losing her, replacing it with the simpler and more punishing version, stop being the thing that scares me. He stood there for a while watching the water. Then he called Ryan and said yes to the retainer. But he told Emma that evening, after dinner. She was on the couch with her book. A new one. The Codebreaker grandmother's story had finished 2 weeks ago, and she'd moved on to something about a girl who discovered her school was built over an old submarine base, which she'd described as incredible, and which he'd started reading over her shoulder when she wasn't looking. I'm going to do some extra work, he said, on top of the hotel job, for Ryan's company. She looked up. The security guy? Yeah. What kind of work? Checking venues, the way I checked the hotel before the event. But planned, organized. He paused. I'd do it maybe once or twice a month. It wouldn't change pickup times or soccer or anything like that. Emma looked at him steadily. But you'd be doing the thing you're good at. He paused. Yeah. She looked back at her book, then up at him again. Is that a bad thing? He sat down in the chair across from her. What do you think? She made the face she made when she was deciding whether a question was real or rhetorical. She decided it was real. I think you were doing the thing you're good at the hotel, and nobody knew it. And then they did know it, and it was kind of fine. She shrugged, with a specific 8-year-old shrug that compressed complex reasoning into one shoulder movement. So maybe doing it on purpose is also fine. He looked at her for a moment. That's a reasonable argument. I know. She went back to her book. Can we get pancakes Saturday? We have stuff to make pancakes. Going out is different. How is it different? Someone else does the dishes. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Fine, he said. Saturday. Emma smiled at her book, the smile of someone who'd conducted a successful negotiation while appearing to read, and Ethan sat in the chair for a moment longer than he needed to before going to do the dishes himself. The Garrett Finch plea agreement was finalized in March. Calloway called Ethan on a Thursday afternoon to tell him, not because Ethan needed to take any action, but because the detective was, Ethan had come to understand, a man who believed in closing loops. Finch had taken a deal, conspiracy to commit murder, with a sentence recommendation that would put him away for the better part of a decade. Morrow and Betty's would still go to trial in the spring, and Ethan would testify in that proceeding, but the central figure in the conspiracy had pled out, and the federal case was effectively resolved. "How do you feel about the deal?" Calloway asked. It was an unusual question from a detective, and Ethan took it seriously. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think I wanted to understand him better, what made it possible to go from losing a company to what he did." "Entitlement," Calloway said. "In my experience, people who've had a lot and then lose it, sometimes the math goes wrong in a specific way. They stop thinking about what they did to cause the loss and start thinking about who owes them the return." He paused. "It's not an excuse, but it's a pattern." "I know the pattern," Ethan said. "I just wanted to see if this was more complicated than that." "It wasn't," Calloway said. "That's usually the disappointing thing. The complicated explanation turns out to be the simple one wearing more clothes." Ethan thought about that for a while after the call. He was in his truck in the hotel parking lot, still in his work clothes, a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat. The March sky was doing something interesting. The flat gray of February breaking up into something more textured, the cloud cover higher and less even, light coming through in places that hadn't seen it in weeks. He ate the rest of the sandwich and went back inside and fixed a running toilet in room 308. The Morrow trial was in April, and it was the least dramatic courtroom experience Ethan had imagined. He'd prepared himself for something more, more procedure, more adversarial pressure, more of the charged atmosphere he associated with the word trial. What he got was a quiet morning in a downtown federal courtroom, a direct examination that took 40 minutes, a cross-examination that lasted 12 and produced nothing of substance, and then he was done. He walked out into the April rain and drove to pick up Emma from school. She asked how it went. He said boring. She seemed to find that reassuring. Morrow was convicted on all counts 2 days after Ethan's testimony, in a verdict that Calloway texted him as a single word, guilty. Ethan texted back a thumbs up, which felt inadequate but was what he had. He heard from Ryan that evening that the conviction would likely have implications for some of the civil litigation still orbiting the Finch case. He said he'd let Ryan deal with tracking that, and Ryan said that was fair. What? Spring shifted things in the way Seattle springs always did. Not suddenly, but steadily. The city lightening by degrees, the water changing color, the particular quality of morning air on a clear day that made the mountains visible from a long way off and reminded you that you were living inside a landscape that was much larger than the city itself. Ethan's work with Ryan's firm had found its rhythm. Once or twice a month he'd get a job, advance work, venue assessment, occasionally a protocol review for a client who was installing a new security infrastructure and wanted a second opinion on the gaps. He developed a system for writing the reports that was clear and specific without being so detailed that the client lost the thread. And Ryan told him 3 separate times that the format was better than what most full-time security analysts produced, which Ethan discounted partially, but not entirely. He kept the hotel job. He'd thought he might not, after a few months of the consulting work, but he found that he didn't want to leave it, not because it paid better than the alternative or because the work was particularly engaging, but because it was his, something he'd chosen from scratch, and Marcus was a decent man to work alongside, and he knew the building's quirks now the way you came to know anything you'd spent enough time with. The freight elevator in the East Wing still threw fault codes when the temperature dropped below 40, and he'd replaced the sensor 3 times, and the elevator probably needed a full system overhaul that the hotel's maintenance budget wasn't ready to approve. And that was irritating in the particular way that known, unsolvable problems were irritating. But it was a real irritation about a real thing, and there was something he'd come to value about that. He ran into Avery Sterling in May, and it was an accident. He was at the Saturday Farmers Market at the south end of Capitol Hill, Emma's preferred Saturday morning activity since March, when she'd discovered a vendor who made flavored honey in varieties she treated with the seriousness of a professional taster. He was standing in line for coffee at one of the market stalls with Emma somewhere behind him inspecting a display of early strawberries, and he heard his name from his left. Avery was in jeans and a jacket he didn't recognize, carrying a canvas bag that had a bunch of kale sticking out of the top, which was such a different visual from the blazer and tablet version of her that he needed a half-second to place her. "I didn't know you came here," she said. "Every Saturday," he said. "Emma and the honey vendor." She smiled. "Which one?" "Third row, the woman with the yellow sign." "I know her. The lavender one is incredible." Emma's current favorite is the wildflower. She puts it on everything. The line moved and he stepped up and got his coffee, and Avery fell in beside him in the natural way of two people who'd been talking and were now walking in the same direction. They moved through the market without particularly deciding to, past the vegetable stalls and the cut flower tables, and a man playing acoustic guitar near the bread vendor with the focused detachment of someone who'd played the same corner for years. "How's the company?" he asked. "Good," she said. "The pilot program finished its second cycle. The feedback structure that Ryan helped design is producing things we didn't expect." She paused. "Better things mostly. One of the engineers in the logistics division flagged a routing inefficiency that 3 of her managers had dismissed twice before. She brought it through the new channel. Turned out she was right. We were running roughly 4% over on delivery costs in the Pacific Northwest region because of the inefficiency she'd spotted. She glanced at him. "We fixed it. It's saving us about $800,000 a year." "Because someone listened," he said. "Because we built something that made it easier to listen," she said. "There's a difference. Personal virtue doesn't scale. Systems do." He looked at her. "That's a good distinction. I've been thinking about it a lot." She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder. "Trying to figure out which things I was getting wrong because I'm personally flawed, and which things I was getting wrong because the structure made them likely to go wrong regardless of my personal flaws." She paused. "Both are true. The proportions are humbling." They'd stopped at the end of the flower stall without planning to, and she was looking at a bucket of white ranunculus with the distracted attention of someone who wasn't really thinking about flowers. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "I've been meaning to say it since the all hands, and I keep getting in my own way." She looked at him. "What you did? Not the physical part, though obviously that mattered, but the part before it. Coming back 3 times. Not leaving even when nobody believed you. That takes a particular kind of stubbornness that I didn't recognize in the moment because I was too busy looking at other things." She stopped. "I think about it when I'm about to dismiss something, or someone. It's become a kind of internal reference point." He was quiet for a moment. The guitar player had shifted to something slower, and the market noise moved around it. "I appreciate that," he said, and meant it in a way that didn't require further expansion. She nodded. "How are you?" she asked. The same direct question she'd asked in the cafe in November, and he'd come to understand it was her actual question, not a social placeholder. "Better," he said, "in ways I didn't expect." "The consulting work?" "Partly." He thought about how to say the rest of it accurately. "I spent a long time thinking that who I was before was incompatible with who I needed to be now. Turns out that was a false choice." He paused. "My daughter pointed that out, actually. 8-year-olds are occasionally inconveniently correct." Avery laughed, the real one, unguarded, the same one that had surprised him in December. "She sounds like someone I'd like to meet. She'd ask you uncomfortable questions. I'm used to that." "Not like this," he said. Emma appeared from somewhere between the strawberry stall and a table covered in ceramic mugs, carrying a small jar of honey in each hand with the expression of someone who had concluded careful research and arrived at 2 definitive findings. She stopped when she saw them, looked at Avery, looked at her father, looked at the honey jars in her hands, and executed a rapid internal recalibration that he recognized from experience. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Avery said. "You must be Emma." Emma looked at her father. "She knows my name." "We've talked," he said. Emma looked back at Avery with the specific focused attention she reserved for things that required serious evaluation. "You're the lady from the hotel." "I am," Avery said. "He saved your life." Emma, Ethan said. That's what happened, Emma said, with the mild defensiveness of someone stating a fact they considered self-evident. That's what happened, Avery agreed. Emma looked at the honey jars again, then back at Avery. Do you like honey? I do. The lavender one is supposed to be really good. I don't usually like lavender, but she said people who don't like lavender usually like hers. She held the jar out. You can try it if you want. Avery took the jar and looked at it, and then looked at Emma with an expression Ethan caught in his peripheral vision. Something open and a little undone. The expression of someone who hadn't expected to be offered honey at a Saturday market by the daughter of the man who'd saved her life and found the experience oddly moving. Thank you, Avery said. Emma shrugged in her elaborately casual way. It's just honey. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, in the middle of the May market noise, and Ethan had the particular awareness he sometimes had of the strangeness of how things connected. The ballroom and the toolbox and the marble floor and the service corridor and all the small pivots that had deposited them here, in the ordinary Saturday morning light, talking about honey. Avery bought the lavender jar. Emma approved. It turned. Months passed, the way months did when your life had found a shape that mostly held. The retainer with Ryan's firm continued. Ethan did 7 assessments over the spring and summer and developed a shorthand with Ryan that made the work faster without making it shallower. Ryan started bringing him into the initial client conversations, not as a closer or a salesman, but as the person who could explain in plain terms what the assessment process actually looked like. And Ethan found he didn't mind that role. He was honest about what he saw and clear about what he couldn't guarantee, and clients seemed to respond to the specificity. He stayed at the hotel through the summer. In August, Okafor offered him a facilities supervisor position. A title change, a modest pay increase, more administrative work, and less physical repair. He thought about it for 10 days and turned it down, which surprised Okafor and didn't surprise Marcus. You're not a supervisor, Marcus said when he heard. I know, Ethan said. You're someone who fixes things. Something like that. Marcus nodded with the expression of a man who'd been right about something for a while and was too polite to say so more directly. The elevator's throwing codes again, he said. I know, Ethan said. I'll look at it. Emma turned 9 in September, and he took her and Mia and 2 other girls from the soccer team to a place in Fremont that did pottery painting, which Emma had wanted to do since the previous year. He sat at the end of the table with a coffee he'd bought from the cafe next door, and watched 4 9-year-olds apply paint to ceramic mugs and bowls with the same intense seriousness that experienced artists brought to large canvases, arguing about technique and color choices with a directness that would have been considered rude in any context involving adults, and was here just the operating standard. Emma made a bowl that she painted dark blue with small gold dots that she said were stars, but were more abstractly shaped than stars. And she worked on it for 2 hours with a focused care that he recognized from the soccer field and from the way she read and from the way she argued about things she thought mattered. Watching her, he thought, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, about what it meant to be this particular person's father. Not the abstract gratitude of a man aware of what he had, but the specific practical reality of it, knowing that she woke up every morning in a house where someone would listen to her, would take her reasoning seriously, would push back when she was wrong and tell her when she was right. Knowing that the version of her that had asked him to be straight with her about changes, that version was being answered honestly, not perfectly, but honestly, which was the best he'd ever been able to promise. He hadn't been the father he planned to be. He hadn't planned anything, really. He'd planned on Claire being there, on sharing the weight of it, on having a partner who could translate him to his daughter, and his daughter to him when the gap between them felt too wide. He'd done it without that. Some days badly. Some weeks where he'd been so inside his own head that Emma had taken care of him as much as he'd taken care of her, which he still felt the wrongness of, even as he understood that she hadn't experienced it as a burden. She was fine. She was genuinely and specifically fine, curious and difficult and funny, and sometimes maddeningly certain about things she'd only partially thought through. And he had loved her so long and so completely that the love had stopped feeling like a feeling and just become the baseline condition of his days. That was the thing about it. He'd spent a long time thinking he needed to become a different person to be what she needed. Quieter, more contained. The version of himself with the dangerous parts removed. And somewhere in the months since November, through the trial and the consulting work and the farmer's market and the conversations with Ryan and the 2 hours in a pottery studio watching his daughter argue about whether gold or yellow was more stellar, he'd understood that she hadn't needed the reduced version. She'd needed him present, which was different. Claire had known that. He'd known it once too, and lost it, and found it again in the broken open way you found things that had always been there. On a Saturday evening in late October, the city held the first real snow of the season. Not the usual Seattle flurry that melted before it landed, actual accumulation. 1 inch by 6 o'clock, 2 inches by 8. The kind of snow that changed the sound of the city, softened its edges, made the streetlights do things with the falling flakes that were difficult to describe practically, but impossible not to look at. Emma stood at the kitchen window for 20 minutes, watching it come down, narrating its progress to no one in particular with the same serious running commentary she brought to soccer games. Then she went and got her jacket and her boots and asked if they could go outside. And he said yes, even though it was almost her bedtime, because it was snow, and she was 9, and there were no remaining arguments against it. They walked down their street and around the block in the dark, Emma ahead of him a few steps, turning her face up to the sky periodically and then reporting back on the experience. The snow was sticking to her hair and her jacket and the collar of her boots, and she didn't seem to notice or didn't care. The neighborhood was quiet in the specific way cities went quiet under snow. Not empty, but muffled, the usual background noise absorbed by something softer. "Dad?" Emma said, somewhere near the end of the block. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He walked a few more steps. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged, still looking up at the snow. "I don't know. You seem like you are. But you also seem like you were before, so I can't always tell." He thought about how to answer it honestly without making it a longer answer than the moment wanted. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Think so or know so? Does it have to be one or the other? Emma considered this. "Mom used to say that," she said. "Yeah, you told me that she used to say you didn't have to be certain about feelings." He looked at her. She'd said it the way she sometimes said things about Claire, matter-of-factly, building her into the conversation the same way she built in anything else she'd learned. He'd worked hard to give her that. The stories, the details, the small, accurate portrait of a person she only half remembered. And hearing it come back like this still caught him somewhere below the chest. "She did say that," he said. "So," Emma said. "Think so is okay." "Think so is okay," he agreed. She reached over and took his hand without particular ceremony, the way she did sometimes still, not because she needed to, he thought, but because she remembered doing it when she was smaller and hadn't decided yet to stop. He held her hand and they walked through the snow in the quiet street, and he thought about the ballroom and the elevator sensor and the toolbox hitting the marble floor and the 14 pages he'd written in February, and Calloway's voice on the phone, and Ryan at Leland's turning his glass, and Avery in the cafe saying this counts, and Emma's voice at 2:19 in the afternoon asking, "Did you get hurt?" and the long line of ordinary days that had connected all of it into something that looked, from this angle, like a life. Not a perfect life. It had gaps and fault lines and deferred repairs and an elevator that kept throwing codes no matter how many times he replaced the sensor. It had a grief at the center of it that didn't resolve, just became more accurately shaped over time, something he could hold without dropping. It had a daughter who was inconveniently correct, and a former Navy captain who kept calling to talk about security protocols, and a CEO who texted him occasionally with questions that were sometimes about work, and sometimes, he thought, about something else neither of them had named. But it was his. The choices were his. The days were his. He didn't need them to be anything more than that. They turned the corner, and the street ahead was unbroken white, their footprints the first marks in the new snow, and Emma made a small sound of satisfaction that wasn't quite a word and squeezed his hand once, and they walked home together through the falling dark. There are people in this world who never get the acknowledgement they deserve, who walk into rooms and get looked at without being seen, whose warnings go unheard because the package they come in doesn't match the expectation. The world runs on those people. on the ones who notice the gap in the coverage, who follow the man with the too clean footwork, who keep going back even when no one is listening, and most of the time it never finds out what it owes them. Ethan Walker didn't need the world to find out. He'd made his peace with invisibility long before a toolbox fell on a marble floor and changed the particular shape of one afternoon. What he needed was simpler and harder than recognition: to be present, to do the work, to be the man his daughter could count on, to be standing at the door when she came through it. He was that man. Imperfectly, on most days adequately, on the best days genuinely. That was enough. For him, on that snowy October evening, walking home through the quiet city with his daughter's hand in his, it was more than enough. It was everything he'd worked to keep.